Hello, it's Michael Pilarski, and I'm here today to tell you about my fairy library and my top 10 books on nature spirits and devas. Now, this all started in 1977 when somebody gave me one of Daphne Charters' first books called A True Fairy Tale. And at that point, I became enamored with fairies, and I started reading about them, collecting books on them, and studying and going to workshops, etc. And so I've been studying fairies for 43 years straight now. And in my library, I now have around over 200 books on fairies and various parts of the fairy realm. And so you might call me a expert on fairies. I mean, there's hardly anybody will brag about that these days. And what I'm let me tell you about the library first. I've been collecting it for years, and just recently I have a friend helping me put it into Library Thing. It's an online catalog system. So you can all go online. We'll put the URL in the description of this video, and you can go there and look at all the 200 books and look at their covers and get a little bit of information. We don't have too many reviews up yet, but we'll be adding those. And so I want this to be an online resource for people who are interested in fairies. If you want to know what the literature is like, you won't find it might be hard to find a longer list of fairy books, especially once we have them all reviewed. And so here's my top 10. And this is on nature spirits and devas. And I'm not going to really spend a lot of time trying to describe who nature spirits and devas are, but it's the intelligences, and the intelligent beings that work with plants and natural phenomena, storms, mountains. There's fairy beings for every scale of the landscape. There's a Devic being, a great Devic being of the whole Pacific Ocean. I mean, Gaia, in a sense, you can almost say that Gaia is the Deva for the whole planet. But they come, and then of course there's the Salish Sea, and then there might be Bellingham Bay, so there's those kind of scales all the way down to rivers and small streams. Every one of those water bodies has you might say, water fairies or the undines that work with them. So, at any rate, Daphne Charters, this is the book that really got me going. Daphne Charters worked for 40 years with the fairies. This is called 40 Years with the Fairies, Volume 1 of Daphne Charters collected fairy manuscripts. So I got to help Daphne get this book into print, and Daphne's now passed on. But this is, of all the fairy books I've read, which is, we're somewhere going into the 300 now, I've never found a one that's more fascinating and a more endearing and more close-up and personal view of fairies, because she worked with the fairies intimately, and the fairies would tell her their stories, their exploits, and what their lives were like, and she would transcribe it. So she was actually, you might say, a scribe to the fairies. They told their stories and she wrote them down. So this is you might say, the fairy stories from the mouth of the fairies themselves. So you won't find anything else quite like this book that has such a personal account. So this is one of the best books to start with, really. It's full of spiritual teachings. Daphne was from England, and born in the 1910. So some of it may seem a little outdated, some of her language and stuff, but that's because she's outdated. But the knowledge and the stories are just still entrancing. So there's Daphne Charters, 40 Years with the Fairies. I'm one of the only sources since I helped get it published. A real classic, the Findhorn Garden Book. Most of you have heard of Findhorn. Findhorn is, you might say, the one of the place or the people that really put devas on the map way back in the early 70s, and through the 70s and onward. Findhorn is still going strong, and this gives the story of the community, how it got going, and how they started working with devas and nature spirits. So that's the classic. They have a newer edition. And the person that did the most of the channeling and talking to the devas there at Findhorn was Dorothy McLean. And so this book here, To Hear the Angels Sing, is a compilation of her writings and messages from the Devic beings. And so this is just one of the, she has quite a few books out, but this is just a real endearing one, and to really give you an idea of what the devas are telling us these days. So there's Dorothy McLean. Here is Dora Van Gelder's book, The Real World of Fairies. This is a classic book. She's a theosophist, again, kind of a contemporary of Daphne, a similar life. However, she communicates with the Devic beings. One of the stories in here that's particularly interesting is she finds out from the Bay of Biscayne in Florida, she gets about the approaching hurricane. You'll never think of hurricanes the same. Hurricanes are steered, you might say, by Devic beings, and they have roles to play. They are discharging energy, they're moving energy and heat, anyway. They're not just a fluke of nature, or they're actually being, you might say, they're managed by the Devic beings. And so, at any rate, Dora Van Gelder gives a lot of information on the nature spirits and Devic beings, small to large. And it's a small book, but it's really one of the best introductions. It's still, after all these years, one of the best little books to start with. A more recent book, much more contemporary book, is Verena Stahl von Holstein's book. So this one is her first one, the one that really got her on the map, you might say. And this is Nature Spirits and What They Say. Now, Verena's story is that she's from Germany, and she moves into a mill house, a really old place, that had a fairy being that started talking to her and introduced her to all the fairies in the neighborhood, the tree fairies, the river fairies, and she became acquainted with the stone fairies and the sand fairies, and some of them were representing really large, you might say, stone being represents a lot of stone. And she tells what the messages that they have for humanity at this time. So a lot of really, you might say, modern information from the fairy realm to the human realm. And Verena, I've read a lot, like I say, I read a lot of books, but when I read Verena's, I was like very impressed. This is really good, high quality material aimed at humans today. It's not just saying, that they fly around and they're cute little things, but no, this is some serious messages for humanity. And she has 4 books out that's translated into English. I believe she has 20 books in German language, but only some of them have been translated. But this is the starting book, you might say. And I actually brought another of her books to show here, because we turn our hearts to the earth. Let me read the subtitle: Nature Spirits on Oil and Human Destiny. Oil, so this is like the word from the petroleum beings, you might say. This is about, and some extent by, the petroleum beings, the beings that we're tapping into when we drain these vast reservoirs of this liquid petroleum in the earth and bring it to the surface and burn it in our engines. And as the fairy said, oh my gosh, that stuff was supposed to be transmuted by humans into light, many thousands of years in the future. It's amazing that you thought of like drilling it up and bringing it up and burning it in vehicles, just like we were flabbergasted. But at any rate, we've let go, you might say, opened up Pandora's box with all this. This gives the esoteric side of what it's meant to the earth to bring all this up and burn it. So it's not more than climate warming here, folks. So here's the word about what we're doing with petroleum from the fairies. And this book here, mermaids, sylphs, gnomes, and salamanders. That's the words for the fairies of the water, the fairies of the air, sylphs, the fairies of the earth, gnomes, and the fairies of the fire, salamanders. And but William Mistel, his work is very impressive to me. And this is dialogues with the kings and queens of nature. So some people go out and talk to their local fairies and see little fairies flying around. Not William Mistel. He goes right to the top. He goes and talks to the kings and queens of these various realms, some of the highest devas of all, devas of the ocean, devas of continents, and devas of volcanoes. And so he really gives a perspective. Again, he relates to these beings and gives their messages to us. But one of the things that's real impressive to me is that when I read this book, I get to know some of these beings as well as an introduction. And he has some exercises, or at least I make some of this stuff into exercises, and this really has gotten me on some incredible journeys to meet some of these high up fairy Davic beings. So William Mistel's writings, and he has 3 or 4 books out now, really gives a you might say a look at from the top of the fairy realm rather than from the little small nature spirits which we usually hear about. And then here we have a popular book. Look at this, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Elves and Fairies. We've all seen this series of books. And when I first saw this on a bookshelf in a store, I'm like, this has got to be just like pablum for the masses. It's got to be really light. It's probably not really going to have it's not going to be very good. But I said, well, I poked my head in it and said, well, maybe I should take a look. I try to collect every book on fairies I can. I recently decided I can't afford to buy every single book on fairies that's available. I've been buying a lot of books lately on fairies. But at any rate, when I got this book home and read it by Serona Knight, I was very pleasantly surprised. It's in my top 10 books. It's full of really good information on the fairy realms. It's a great introduction for just any regular person. It's aimed at the masses, so to speak, but it's full of exercises and things you can do and little ceremonies you can do. So this is a great beginner's book. It won't put people off too much. It stays pretty, you might say, soft and gentle, but it's full of really good information and what you can do to be in touch with the fairies. So I really recommend this as well. And the last 2 books, again, these are by the same author here. Now, this is Marko Pogacnik, and his first book here is called Nature, Spirits, and Elemental Beings. Marko is from Slovenia, and he does a lot of work with standing stones and creating standing stones and working with earth elements and balancing ley lines. And he's an earth geomancer, and I'm really impressed with his work. And here he talks about the different, you might say, the smaller types of fairies and elemental beings, and then up into the Davic realm. But this is, again, a really useful modern day look. This is a pretty recent book, and Marko is widely regarded as one of the leaders in the world right now, talking about how humans can help heal the earth by working with the nature spirits. And this is also one of Marko's books, Sacred Geography. And in here he's working more with the larger beings in the landscape and with Gaia, and how can we correct the imbalances in the earth? How can we bring the earth back to health? How can humans bring themselves back to health, of course, is part of the equation. But he gives a lot of exercises in here, things you can do. For instance, one of them is that I use is imagine yourself as a tree, and you have roots going into the ground that come out of your feet and go into the ground for a ways, and they go down there and they branch out, and at the end of each of those roots you have an eye, and then you open all your eyes, and what do you see? So it's a way of seeing into the earth. Anyway, he has a lot of exercises that people can do to tune into the earth energies and how can we influence and work with the earth. And so Marco is going to be one of the presenters at our Fairy and Human Relations Global Congress we're doing. And so now you might say a word from your sponsor. The Fairy and Human Relations Congress is an event that's happening January 15th to 17th. And one of the reasons I've really been getting my fairy library all put together and cataloged is because we're, in a sense, preparing for this big fairy congress. And we're bringing together a couple hundred people from around the world that work with fairies. And we're going to put our heads together, and we're going to listen to some of the world experts on on fairies and Davic beings and she beings and dragons, etc., in the world today. So we'd like to invite you all to attend the Fairy and Human Relations Congress. There's a URL link in this video description below, so you can tune into it if you hadn't heard of us already. So there's the start of my introduction to the Fairy Library. This is the first 10 books, and then we're going to do 10 books on the she coming up, and then we'll do the next 10 books on this fairies, and then we might do one on, books on dragons, for instance, or books on techno-elementals. And we have all these different books, and we might even do one, we'll do one on children's books on fairies. So you can read these little fairy stories that will give some information to the young ones as well. So, at any rate, do stay tuned. Check back. We hope to have lots of more videos on our fairy library at coming down the line. So thanks very much for watching and listening. This is Michael Pilarski, the Fairy Library. May the fairies be with you.